Hello, let's move on to lesson 4 of topic 4, our last lesson in our ecosystem topic. This is cycles of matter. So there are two laws that you need to remember. There's a law of conservation of mass, which states mass or matter cannot be created or destroyed. So the start of the fire equals the same mass as the end of the fire, which all the gas and the ashes equal the same mass as the start of the fire and the wood and all of that. So the law of conservation of energy states that energy cannot be created or destroyed. It could only change from one state to another. So like changing state from a gas to a liquid, that energy is not created or destroyed, just changed. So let's talk about the water cycle. The water is made up of 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom, making H2O. So 2 hydrogen, 1 oxygen makes the formula H2O. And this water is essential for life. And water cycles continuously from the Earth's surface to the atmosphere and back in various forms of states. So the water cycle starts with evaporation and then goes to condensation and precipitates back to the Earth's surface. So what is evaporation? That's when liquid water changes to gas or water vapor. Evaporation doesn't have to be just water, but since we're talking about the water cycle, we're talking about water. So water changes to a gas, changes from liquid to a gas. And this happens at the surface of liquid water and rises to the atmosphere. So it starts at the surface and rises to the atmosphere. And sunlight is providing that energy for that to happen. Water can evaporate from large and small bodies of water, so like a puddle evaporating, or the ocean. The ocean has water evaporating constantly. We just can't really see it the way we see puddles evaporating since it's so big. Okay, so a small amount of water evaporates from living things too. Plants release water vapor from their leaves, and that's called transpiration. It's kind of like plants are sweating. And animals release this water vapor in wastes and when they exhale. So we could see that in the cold. When we're breathing out, we see that water vapor changing from a gas, from liquid to gas. Okay, so let's move on to condensation. This water vapor, the gas, changes to a liquid as the gas cools. So water droplets condense around dust particles, and that's how clouds form. So water droplets condensing around dust particles form clouds that we see. And then dew, that is water that's condensed on plants and other objects. So as you see dew on a window, that's water condensing. So again, condensation, gas is changing to a liquid as that gas cools. Okay, and then precipitation, that is water falling to the surface of the earth from clouds. So precipitation can fall into oceans, lakes, or rivers, or it may soak into soil and become groundwater, or it may run off to land and into the rivers and oceans. So it could fall anywhere basically. And there's types of precipitation. There's rain, sleet, hail, and snow. And that all depends on temperature. Okay, so moving on from the water cycle, let's talk about the carbon and oxygen cycle. We kind of remember this from when we were talking about photosynthesis and cell respiration. It's kind of the same concept. So producers use carbon to make food and release oxygen. Consumers breathe that oxygen and get carbon by consuming or other living things. And then CO2 is released during cellular respiration. And decomposers break down those dead organisms and release carbon back into the soil or into the air. Right? And carbon and oxygen are essential from life. Carbon is the building blocks of all living things. And carbon and oxygen cycle through photosynthesis and cellular respiration, like we said. Okay, so producers use carbon to make food. consumers breathe the oxygen that producers release, and they get their carbon by consuming other living things. And then CO2 is released during cellular respiration, and decomposers break down dead organisms and release carbon back into the soil or air, recycling that carbon. Okay. Human activities can affect the levels of carbon and oxygen in the air. For example, burning gas, natural gasoline, and plant fuels release CO2 into the atmosphere, and CO2 levels also rise when trees or forests are cleared. All right, let's move on from the carbon and oxygen cycle to the nitrogen cycle. So nitrogen is the building block for proteins and DNA, so we need nitrogen. We can't just take in nitrogen in its simplest form. Bacteria need to fix nitrogen in the air so it could be used by plants. Okay, so lightning can also fix the nitrogen, but only about 10% of nitrogen needed by producers is fixed. Okay, so how do we fix nitrogen? It combines other elements to form usable nitrogen that we could absorb. So nitrogen passes to consumer after consumer until a decomposer again recycles the nitrogen back into free oxygen in the air, and the cycle continues. Let's revisit that. So nitrogen is the building block for proteins and DNA, so we need nitrogen. Bacteria fixes that nitrogen in the air by combining other elements to form usable nitrogen-containing compounds that plants can take up. And then consumers eat those plants and passes the nitrogen on in a cycle until the decomposer eventually converts it back into nitrogen, free nitrogen into the air. And it just cycles back. So free oxygen turns into fixed oxygen, and then producers can obtain that fixed nitrogen, and the cycle goes from producer to consumer and then eventually to a decomposer, recycling that nitrogen back into free nitrogen. Okay, and that's it. Thank you for watching, and I hope this helped.